Okay, everyone, welcome. We're so glad that you all have decided to come and spend your afternoon with us today. We're going to go ahead and we'll get started and we'll let more of our attendees trickle in. But welcome to our webinar in our Ethics and Future of Work series, exploring ethics and intentional hybrid work. This webinar series is put on by the Center for Health, Work and Environment and the Center for Bioethics and Humanities. We're so happy that you all have decided to join us today. We have a really great conversation planned for you. My name is Madison Crapo. I am the Events and Training Coordinator with the Center for Health, Work and Environment, and I will be in the chat today helping you with any technical logistics or any questions that you have. So we'll go ahead and we'll go over just a few quick housekeeping remarks, and then we'll get started with this conversation. So this webinar is in Zoom webinar format. So that means that all of our participants will be kept on mute throughout the duration of this presentation. Please use the chat function, however, if you would like to chat with us about any technical logistics that you're having or any questions regarding Zoom. If you have questions for our panelists regarding the topic of this webinar or anything that they're talking about, please go ahead and use the Q&A box on the control panel of your screen. This way our panelists can see the questions that you're asking, and other attendees can also see these questions. If you're an attendee that likes one of the questions that's being asked, you can go ahead and like the question so that our moderators can see which questions are getting the most traction. Closed captioning is also available for this webinar. You can turn on closed captioning in the control panel of your screen. For those of you who are here for some continuing education credits at the end of this webinar, there will also be a survey to complete. So once you exit out of the webinar, you can complete this survey. We also really appreciate any feedback that you have that you can give us about this webinar series. So please put that in the survey as well. And then finally, this webinar will be recorded so that you can share with any of your colleagues or anyone else that's interested. This recording will be available in the email that you receive at the end of the webinar, and that will be through a YouTube link. So without further ado, I hope that kind of gives a good overview of what you can expect today. I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Matt Winia from the Center for Bioethics and Humanities.
Thank you so much, Madison. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us for lunch today, or whatever time zone you happen to be in. Well, first of all, I'm Matt Winia. I direct the Center for Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Colorado, and this is a terrific, example of the benefits of remote work. I am at home in my basement recovering from COVID right now, so apologies for the gravelly voice. And appreciation for the opportunity to do this, despite being sort of in recovery right now. By the way, before we jump in, I want to note that on November 2nd, we will have the next in this series. So mark your calendars now. Lee Newman, the head of our Center for Work, Health and Environment, will be moderating a discussion about the ethics of academic industry collaboration around worker health. So academic industry interactions around worker health coming up November 2nd. Our panelists today, I'm very excited to speak with, and I'm going to start by just introducing them, and then we're going to dive right into maybe one of the more contentious issues related to ethics and remote and hybrid work. So I'll start by introducing Julia Beckel. Julia is a fourth-year PhD student in industrial and organizational psychology at CSU, Colorado State University. And she's an occupational health psychology trainee supported by a NIOSH Research Center grant. She does really interesting research to understand how telework relates to overall worker health and well-being. Before she entered graduate school, she worked for the FAA on their National Aerospace Systems Human Factors Safety Research Lab team. And so her research is really fascinating and has examined how work design affects occupational stress, chronic illness, and she also has a particular focus on the health and safety of vulnerable working populations. And when she's not working, Julia spends time with her husband. She has two dogs, or they have two dogs, and she loves to mountain bike. Second, I'll introduce Rashida Creighton-Childress. Rashida is a journalist. She's worked for several publications, including the Kansas City Star, Education Technology News, and Associations Now, and she was recently named senior editor at the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Rashida covers workplace issues. And the reason she ended up on our panel today is because she's written in the last year a number of incredibly insightful and sometimes very provocative articles on how the evolution of remote and hybrid work has affected all of us during the pandemic. And so she has an incredible stock of people she's interviewed, experts, and people in the real world who really understand and see how this new world is impacting employees and employers, and what are the best practices that are emerging in the field. She is based in the DC area, where she lives with her spouse and 2 children. And finally, Dr. Lily Tenney. Lily is the Associate Director for Outreach and Programs at the Center for Health, Work, and Environment. And she's an assistant professor in our School of Public Health and teaches graduate courses in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. Her research is in implementation science, and she's the co-founder and director of our Health Links program, which helps businesses identify solutions for supporting what they call total worker health. And we'll come back to that in a moment. She has over 10 years of experience conducting research, but also working with employers on interventions to improve working conditions. And over the pandemic, she has helped a number of employers, including our own university, develop our policies to address remote work and return to work, and to adapt to the rapidly evolving work environment. So let me jump in with a few questions around one of the major concerns in terms of the ethics of remote work that has been raised really since even before the pandemic, but certainly during the pandemic. And those are questions around equity. And Lily, I wonder if we could start with you, because there have been concerns, again, even before the pandemic. I remember reading articles about how remote and hybrid work might worsen disparities, in particular gender disparities, but also racial, ethnic, geographic disparities, socioeconomic disparities in terms of who has access to remote work, who chooses to go into remote work, whether those, I should put choices in scare quotes here, because it's not always been a choice, obviously. So I guess I'd like to start with just asking you, what are sort of your biggest concerns or worries in terms of equity issues and the ways in which remote and hybrid work have initially been forced upon us and are now being developed in a more intentional way?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I'm really excited to be participating today, and it's exciting to see the breadth of attendance from across the country, and I think a couple of international folks. So you raise a really great first question, and coming at it from the lens of worker health and safety. Fundamentally, remote work worsens inequality by mostly helping high income earners. So we know that the higher a person's salary, the more likely they are to be able to work from home for a variety of reasons, but primarily because those types of jobs are the ones that are able to be done in a telecommuting or a remote work arrangement. And so even before COVID, as you said, there have been issues around the socioeconomic inequalities that remote work has raised, but we really saw this result in larger disparities across these socioeconomic groups and across industries. And the concerning part from a worker health and safety standpoint, public health standpoint, is that that those that have the ability to work remotely and are higher earners have potentially better access to benefits. So when COVID hit, those that were able to work remote were the ones that were able to keep their jobs, right? So we saw restaurant workers get laid off. We saw construction companies shut down. There was major impact on those industries that couldn't sustain remote work. So what does that mean now with what we know around the benefits of remote work and even existing and potential programs and incentives and benefits both on the individual and organizational side to offer remote work really means a deep assessment to look at how we can achieve equal access to remote work across all income levels. And when you look at the ability to do that with high risk industries like manufacturing, where people, where the rates of workplace injuries and illnesses and access to benefits and income is most at risk, that will continue to be a challenging problem as it, in regards to inequality and disparities. And so we're absolutely challenged with identifying how telecommuters and remote work and all the possible benefits that I'm sure we'll touch on today that stem from flexible schedules, improving work-life balance, having the ability to have less commuting time, which could therefore have savings and more time with family, impacts those that don't have access to that opportunity, to that choice. And so that's really what is the greatest inequity facing this paradigm of remote work that we've seen as it relates to work and health.
Julia, I'm going to turn to you next, because in our pre-call for this conversation, you really raised something that I thought deserves mention right off the top, which is there are also ways in which remote work can alleviate disparities. And your work on with people with disabilities, for example, some of whom have really benefited from the opportunity to do remote work. So can you lay out for us what are some of the bigger opportunities in terms of alleviating inequities by implementing remote work?
Sure, absolutely. So I think a good starting place is to say that the advent of remote work for leveling disparities in the workplace isn't necessarily new. So the Americans with Disability Act, 1990, we see telework promoted as a way to benefit workers with chronic health conditions and disability by way of increasing workability and increasing retention. So in the past, however, we've seen courts and organizations really hesitant to approve teleworking accommodations with concerns saying, workers won't be able to meet the essential functions of their job. And I think that with this big sweep towards teleworking that we saw as a result of COVID-19, some of those concerns have become really alleviated and mitigated. And for instance, right around the beginning of the pandemic, I had just started some research with workers with disability and chronic health conditions who had just transitioned over to telework. And while looking over some of our qualitative data, what we see is workers saying, without the ability to telework, I wouldn't be able to uphold my position or complete my work activities. And it's really allowed them a way to feel the symptoms of their disease. For instance, we have, participants discussing, I can now just accept, I have a chronic pain condition at home. I can just be in pain and take care of myself using coping mechanisms that maybe aren't as conducive to the office environment. And because I can do these things, I can better enact my work role and stay employed. And we know that when people can stay employed and contribute to the competitive, workplace, we see better outcomes for worker health, decreased depression, less early retirement. So there is a way to really leverage the flexibility that telework affords to bolster these vulnerable working populations in a way that hasn't been utilized as much in the past.
Yeah. Rashida, I want to turn to you next, because one of the one of the reports that I really want to make sure people are aware of, you did a fantastic piece recently about how diversity in hiring in some organizations has improved during the pandemic. In some cases, very dramatic changes in the diversity of the hires coming into major corporations. So what did you find? And do you think telehealth is a part of what's driving these successes? And if so, how does that work?
Yeah, there's been not a ton of research on this. And so I think this is one area where researchers kind of need to get in. But there's been just a lot of little short reports that have come out, these sort of worker surveys. The Future Forum did some where they looked at people and they found that underrepresented groups, women, minorities, like telework. They really enjoy it more so than non-underrepresented groups. And then Facebook, which has been around for many years and has been roundly criticized year after year for their lack of diversity. And they would come out and they would say, we're going to do better. And then their report would come out the next year and they didn't do better. And now they're Meta, Facebook changed its name to Meta. And their most recent report in 2022 was just gangbusters. They reached 2024 diversity goals this year in 2022, 2 years at a time. And they kind of attribute their success to telework and the ability to have a wider pool of applicants. So they're hiring more diverse staff. And we really just need a little bit more research to understand why, because it's not really that clear. Meta didn't give a lot of data about how many, how broad their applicant pool was. If their applicants went from 1 in 5 minorities to 3 in 5 minorities, you would say, oh, you're automatically sort of tripling your chance of hiring a minority. But they didn't give us that data, so we don't know. And the reason could be that they're getting a broader applicant pool, or the reason could also just be that maybe when you're hiring for a teleworker, you're thinking about different kinds of things. In the field of diversity and equity and inclusion in the workplace, one of the biggest obstacles has always been this idea of fit. Like, is someone the right fit? And fit has typically mean, is someone like me? Do I want to have a burger with this person? Do I want to take them to lunch? Do you want to grab a beer afterwards? Do you want to hang out in the office? Is this someone I see like that? Well, if you're not in the office together, you don't have those considerations. So the question with telework is that helping so that people are really judging you on the content of your character and not whether or not they want to grab a beer with you after work? But we don't have the research. So I think that's going to be something moving forward to see sort of what is it that's bringing it and how do we translate that to other positions? Because, I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they're like only about 37% of jobs can be done by telework. So if telework is increasing diversity, but you only have 30% of the workforce where you get increased diversity, that's really not enough. So you want to figure out what are these, if it's truly telework, what principles about telework is making it more diverse, and how do we apply that to the rest of our working universe?
And I just found that so fascinating because from the ethical standpoint, this question of what if one of the reasons why diversity hiring is improving is because people are more comfortable hiring a so-called diverse candidate if they don't have to be with that person in the same physical space. Is that okay? I mean, in the end, it's getting a more diverse pool, and maybe being in the same virtual space is an entree to being in the same physical space. So I could see the sort of pragmatic approach, which would say that's ethically acceptable as a stepwise progression towards having a diverse environment. But I could also see someone saying, well, that's fundamentally wrong if the thing that was preventing people from diverse hiring is this fit issue to begin with. And that there should be some kind of direct approach to that. Julia?
I'm wondering if it's okay if I add on a couple
Yeah,
of just
please.
thoughts to this. So I think that this raises a really good question, and it's something that is going to hopefully be tackled by researchers in multiple fields moving forward. But in the industrial organizational psychology world, we talk about the digital divide. So when we hire using technology-based methods and we support remote work, are we preventing certain demographic or working populations from being able to access those technology, and therein, creating more disparity. But on the other end, there is how do we leverage these technologies to create greater access? And so I think one interesting thing to think about is the type of jobs that maybe Meta or Facebook were hiring for in the past and where those were physically located. So were these jobs located in high income, expensive, big metropolitan areas where, people who can afford to live maybe are more likely to apply because there's shorter commutes for them. They have easier access, they can drive to work versus, taking another form of transportation. But now you can say, well, somebody who's living in maybe a more rural area, but has an internet connection and has the skills that can be leveraged, well, now they're maybe more likely to apply for that job. And now that geographic barrier isn't as, stark when it comes to hiring employees. So maybe I would love to see, moving forward, some information around what barriers are removing when we are trying to really hire a more diverse working population.
And Lily or Rashida, maybe either one of you might have insight into this. Are we seeing less of what I had conceived of as sort of a penalty for telework? Prior to the pandemic, there were some papers about telework that essentially said, if you choose to telework, and this is where I put choose in scare quotes, you're more likely to be a woman, you're more likely to, have other things going on at home. There are reasons why you're making this choice, and you will be penalized for it in terms of your career. Because you're not in the office, you're not making the connections, you're not, bumping into people at the water cooler. All the benefits of in-person work do not accrue to you. Has that mitigated with the pandemic and the fact that so many people are now doing telework that we don't have to worry so much anymore about people being penalized in their career for a choice to do remote work?
Well,
Well,
go ahead. You go first.
I was just gonna say, I think it just depends on where you work, because in some
Okay.
offices, if you've got a lot of remote work, it's not going to penalize you. But we do have, what everyone's talking about right now, this push-pull between supervisors who want people in the office and those who don't. So if you've got, if you work at Tesla, you are penalized for wanting to remote work. That's how it is. But for a lot of organizations, that penalty has gone away.
And I echo that in that it's been normalized, right? That the reports are out there, the articles are out there around the benefits on both sides. And that demand on the worker side, on the employee side, because there has been an opportunity and a choice, a forced choice, first of all, right, to be able to work from home because it wasn't an option, which has now forced companies to make it an option, has lessened the judgment and helped normalize remote work and for equal or competitive positions to some of what we've talked about today. But there's definitely still a disconnect that has been shown. The data shows that this disconnect is presented with really around the work-life boundaries that are blurring, where remote workers feel like they are sacrificing work-life boundaries in some cases, right? They're the demand to be available. There's lots of data showing that remote workers are constantly connected and not taking lunch breaks compared to when they were in office. And obviously we're speaking about a certain subset of the workforce. And then you have managers that think productivity is declining, and that may be a perception, right? It's perceived, and in some cases, it's actually been because there's data that has been implemented through technologies for monitoring remote work performance. And so you have remote workers saying, my productivity has skyrocketed and I'm actually blurring some of these work-life boundaries that existed when I was in office, and managers saying, thinking and maybe proving that there's a decline in productivity. So that's really shown a light on this disconnect, which forces us to think about how in which we should be measuring performance of remote work. And first and foremost, I think it raises an issue of trust on the side of organizations and managers to be able to not penalize those workers that are remote, and think of new ways to be measuring performance, so that people don't feel like they're being surveyed. There's not a surveillance system that's watching their every move if they're working remote.
It's such a nice entree to the next set of questions I wanted to ask you all, which is about this issue of trust and accountability. There was actually just yesterday, a randomized controlled trial was reported from the Harvard Business Review, looking at a company that was willing to randomize their employees to either working mostly from home, working mostly on site, or working hybrid. And they saw the hybrid work in employees actually had an increase. And by the way, they used a really interesting methodology. They were tracking the content of the emails that all these workers sent. And they saw a 58% increase in the number of unique email recipients among people who were hybrid compared to those working mostly at home or mostly in the office. And the content of the emails had more novel content. So they suggested that hybrid work was actually more effective. And I'm wondering if, I don't track this research closely, except in the week before a panel discussion like this. I'm wondering, is that actually the direction that you're seeing research go? Is it looking? Because I have to say, intuitively and from conversations with people, my impression has been that complete remote is not as good as completely in person, and that hybrid is the worst of both worlds. But what they found is exactly the opposite of my intuition. So I'm curious where you see the field going in terms of what is the optimal. And by the way, I'll also say, I don't think we really have much of a choice. We're going to have to figure out how to do hybrid stuff. So it may not matter which works best, because we may have this sort of the impetus to do hybrid is so strong that even if it's worse in some ways, we may be forced into it. But I am very curious to hear your read of the current literature. And I'll start again with Lily on this, but I'd love to hear each of your thoughts.
So thanks, Matt. And I am not, I don't consider myself an expert on that literature of hybrid and performance outcomes. But what I do know from our work with employers, during COVID response and post-COVID response, is that there's definitely no way around what you're saying, which is to create an option for both in the cases of companies that have decided to keep their doors open, right? So we saw that group that decided to go completely satellite, and that gives us an opportunity to show how the work arrangements are changing to fully remote. And there's certain benefits around that, primarily around having an equal playing field. Everyone has the same, everyone's in the same boat, and that has certain advantages. Hybrid is absolutely essential in cases where telecommuting and office arrangements, or the choice to be in office, is raising opportunities really quickly about what people miss out on when they're not in the office. And that's around just around what happens for personal connection. And it could be business related, or it can be, personal between two people or groups of people. And so finding ways that hybrid work or hybrid work models can replicate that and still have options. I think the key word for, the theme that we're talking about right now is around choice, around options, and the ethical issues that raises when those options and choices aren't available. But as it relates to productivity and performance, I don't think we know what the best combination is right now, because one of the reasons, which is the nature of the job and the work, is very different for those of us in academia, where we're working on grants and research studies and conducting work, versus someone who works in technology or a startup. Very different metrics.
Yeah. Rashida, I wonder if I could go to you next, because this question of how to, well, first of all, what are the benefits and the sort of productivity benefits of being in the office, passing along experience, interacting with each other. There was a piece in the New York Times just this week about Jeffries in New York City saying they want everyone back in the office. And it's largely because, and they're largely, by the way, not speaking to junior employees, they're speaking to the senior employees saying, we need you in the office so that you can interact with junior employees who need you to be there, because sometimes you'll recognize that they're stuck on something before they even realize they're stuck. I just remember that it was a great quote in this article about sort of the benefits of having bosses and their employees in the same space together. But when people are at home, I think there's an underlying, I have to say, it's a mistrust that junior employees or people even who are knowledge workers are not intrinsically motivated, that they won't work unless they're being monitored. So I'm curious, what are we seeing in terms of monitoring work? And how worried are we about the intrusiveness of those monitoring systems? And sort of what's the evolutionary path there?
Yeah, and again, it's all going to depend on what kind of business you've got. But if you've got a business that has primarily been in person and they like in person and the people at the top like in person, you do get more of this monitoring, more of this distrust of employees. I think the hard part with hybrid is that, when people say hybrid work, they got in their mind that hybrid work means that you need to come in the office 2 days a week or 3 days a week or whatever, some sort of set number. They want consistency. And that's may not be the best for hybrid work if you're looking at best practices, because not everybody wants the same thing. And it's almost like having a family a little bit. And, you may have a screaming 3-year-old coming up to you yelling, ice cream, ice cream, ice cream. And you as a parent may be like, I love ice cream, let's do it. But you got your 6-year-old going, I want to paint this picture. I don't want to go anywhere. And if you grab the 6-year-old and take them to ice cream, they're pouting, they're angry, they're unhappy. The 3-year-old's happy, you're happy, but you got this other person who's not. And I think hybrid is, it's us having to figure out, how do we make everybody in this little family happy with the situation? And so some of the better hybrids are people saying, and I think there was an article at Amazon, they've kind of said, teams figure out how to work. What is it that your people need to do their jobs? And that's what you guys do. And that but people don't really like that at the top. They're like, I want a system. I want everyone to be kind of fair, because this gets into inequity issues. Why does that person get to remote work if I don't get to remote work if you have teams? But in all honesty, that tends to be how it's worked, to try to figure out what's working best for each individual team. Your manufacturing team cannot work from home. That's unfortunate, but that's just how it works. And now you can offer them more flexibility. And I know the American Psychological Association, they have asked CEOs, as a matter of mental health for all employees, to allow as much flexibility as they can, because they think that allows for better workers. But it's going to be tough. Each organization you can't just say hybrid work means 2 days a week in the office. You've got to actually look at your organization and see what its needs are and see what its people's needs are and create hybrid in that way, which is hard. And a lot of people don't want to do it. And that's why you're getting a lot of pushback, because they're offices or teams that don't need to come in 2 days a week. They can come in once a month. They can have a picnic every, 3 months and it works fine. But,
Interesting.
I think
Julia,
that's really, I really quick, I just want to make a comment on that, because
please.
I think the reports that have come out have really shown the importance of preference. And there's been some assumptions that have been made around needing to create these monitoring systems or decide on going one way or the other. But some of these reports really show that this preference really depends on that individual. And that there was one that came out from Pew Research Center, which I'm happy to share in the chat, which is really enlightening, because it shows that drastic shift from 2020 to where we are now in 2022, with the number of individuals that were working from home because they had to, versus now because of choice. And for those workers with jobs that can be done from home who are choosing to go into the workplace, it's primarily because of preference and productivity. It's not the minority cited that they feel pressure from their supervisor or coworkers to be there. So the reasons people are going back when they do have the choice, it's because they feel that they feel more productive in the workplace, right? I think those of us that have had little kids running around or having to navigate that over the last 2 years, we're dying to get back into a more traditional workplace and have to be able to compartmentalize work from home. The other reasons are around they have, I think there's also just an assumption that if you work from home, you have a proper space. And that's not always the case. And that was really exposed. So that's another primary reason, but it's not because they feel like they have to, or that they're going to be judged if they don't.
And I will just add that there is a generational difference when Lily mentioned space, that, particularly in cities, young people with 3 roommates do not want to work from home. They want to go into an office and have space. And there is almost on some level with certain generations an expectation that they had leaving college that they were going to work in an office. And a lot of people kind of want to have that, and they want to have those other people that they can talk to and be mentored by. And so organizations do have to look at that. They have to look at the whole spread of their workforce. How many people do you have who this is their first job? How many people who've been in the job for 20, 30 years, and kind of figure out, how to align those.
I have a question that's almost a side note, but it was triggered by this talk about sort of preferences and compartmentalization of home life, work life. One of the questions in the Q&A was around, should we expect or require people to be visually present online? And obviously that can make a difference in terms of interactions, like our interaction today. But there are also reasons why people might prefer to have their camera turned off. And some of that, by the way, may relate back to some of our equity concerns earlier. Julie, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on best practices in terms of camera use for work, meetings and so on.
Sure. I think that it's a really nuanced question. So I think the first kind of response I would have to that question about whether or not somebody should have their camera on in a meeting would be, why? Why does the receiver, or why does the work itself kind of demand that physical face-to-face preference? And if that answer to that why is really related to the nature of the work, then maybe it is something that needs to be evaluated and considered more widely. On the other end, if it's not, and it's not, diminishing the quality of work or the amount of work that gets finished, then maybe it isn't a big of a deal. On the other hand, we know that the more rich is a term from the literature of the media that you're using, the more rich the media you're using, the better social integration that you're going to have among members of a team, the more able one is to pick up on social cues in a conversation, and especially for work that is highly interdependent, where one person's relying on another quite frequently and vice versa. In those situations, we know that using face-to-face forms of media is the best practice, and you're going to see the best social and potentially performance outcomes as a result of being able to better evaluate the social environment of the group that you're working with. So I think that, kind of going back to this, kind of back to the last thing we were talking about, when you bring new employees in and all of a sudden we're in this virtual world, we do know that when individuals use face-to-face communication like Zoom, Teams, Skype, etc., we see better socialization outcomes. So individuals get to know their teammates better. They form better relationships with their managers and leaders. They learn norms of communication and behavior, even in a virtual setting, better when they have that face-to-face communication. At the same time, I still encourage everybody to really just touch on that intentional piece of, in this moment, or based on the work that we're doing, is this a necessity? Is this, a demand from the job itself? Or is it something that we need to reach a organizational goal? Or otherwise, is it okay if every now and again, we leave cameras off? And one last, touch there, I agree, individuals don't always feel at their best to be able to be on that camera. And to the extent it might lend somebody some flexibility or some grace to be able to go throughout their day and still perform, I think that leaving cameras off in that instance is just fine. So like I said, very nuanced, but good question.
I think it's really interesting, Julia, because of how much we've learned through this experience of Zoom and what we felt, right, personally, with how that technology has introduced the fatigue that we feel when we're on camera every day. And I think it hits on how complex and individualized it needs to be by not just the situation, but by company and the purpose. I think fundamentally we need to be asking, what do we want out of this? What is the job? Are we trying to brainstorm? I, for one, was, thinking that brainstorming would be a great activity to have cameras on for. Turns out when you're focusing your attention on looking at faces, you're not paying as much of it as to hearing ideas, content. Right? The content.
Really interesting. Yeah.
If the purpose is to connect and try and get to that human connection, cameras should be on. We know that it can be awkward if you're in a smaller group setting and someone has their camera off. There might be questions that are raised. Why is their camera off? So communication, disclosing, also brings forth that question around what vulnerabilities have come forth with remote workers because of not being able to hide some of those. Being invisible in a Zoom space is actually hard to do in some cases where you turn your camera off and you're the only one who has their camera off.
Absolutely. And just to, one last comment on that. So there is research that shows, especially as you bring in this notion of individual differences, there is research that shows that for women and for less tenured employees, having your camera on, for meetings is actually more fatiguing for those groups than it is, males or higher tenure employees. A lot of that has to do with that, that impression management and, you're now in your own home and now people are seeing you. That impression management, it uses more in energy resources when conducting meetings. And I think of I'm still in graduate school. Whenever we first transitioned to full-time remote in graduate school, I was at the time living in a 700 square foot home with my husband, who was also teleworking. So with 2 dogs, and trying to manage having my camera on and dogs in the background, and also potentially seeing my husband, walking behind me, that was a lot to handle. So I think having, flexibility and intention with the way we communicate face-to-face or virtually is very important.
We got a we're getting a lot of really interesting comments in the chat, so I hope people have their chat turned on. But Rashida, I wanted to turn to you with one of the questions that came through in the Q&A, which is still along these lines of productivity and sort of productivity management. And I wonder if it's too early for us to know the answer to this question, but there are concerns from management that productivity is declined, is lower with at-home work. There are plenty of individuals who say I'm much more productive. There's probably some research on this, but what the questioner is asking is, if you take it across a whole company, how does that play out? Because we also have some evidence, I think, that if you allow more flexibility in work, you have better retention. And so even if you do have some individuals who sort of take advantage of the situation and don't work as hard because they're not being monitored as much, could it be that overall the company is more productive because you have better retention and higher morale sort of across the board? And again, maybe it's too early to know, but I think of all of you, you're the one most likely to have seen research or data on this. Have you seen anything about sort of overall company productivity and not just, productivity at the individual worker level?
Yeah, I haven't necessarily seen a lot about overall productivity, but I will say I have seen a lot about retention. And
Mhm.
when someone leaves your company, it takes the new person that you hire 3 to 6 months to actually get to the point where
Yeah.
the old person was. So if you're losing 6 months every time somebody leaves, it's probably a good idea to try to keep those people. And if what's keeping those people there is going to be the fact that they're able to telework, then that's a good idea, because you're going to get so many more benefits of having that consistency, of having that employee who's able to maintain productivity. Because when they leave to go somewhere else that's not offering telework, you're starting basically kind of at zero, and you're losing that productivity. And you're also irritating your other employees who have to pick up the slack because the new person can't do their job effectively. And so retention wise, it's really a good idea. And the studies on productivity are kind of up in the air. They're some are saying, you're really productive, you're less productive if you're working remotely, and some are saying you're more productive. And so it's we haven't got like really good, consistent data on that yet.
I wonder, Lily, can you put this conversation in the framework of total worker health? I said we would come back to that. Not everyone listening right now might know what total worker health means, although it's semi-intuitive. But how do you put the hybrid remote work conversation into that framework, in the sense of both the pros and the cons in terms of total worker health?
Thanks, Matt. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term total worker health, we are one of 10 centers of excellence for total worker health in the country. And total worker health refers to an approach that was founded from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health as a way to look holistically across the paradigm of health and safety. So it's finding ways in which organizations can support the health, safety, and well-being through benefit compensation, through different safety policies and programs, and then taking a deeper dive into some of the areas around health promotion, including mental health. And the occupational health psychology field has been very key to advancing total worker health, and this research has been happening for decades. And so it's really looking across disciplines and to really address the solutions for the future of work and what all workers need. And so remote work, as it relates to total worker health, really, I think, highlights some important areas, specifically around organizational supports. This has, as you mentioned, Julia, found ways to bring conversations about those people with disabilities. and providing opportunities, not just at the organizational level or individual level, but ways in which companies can be looking at better supporting the well-being of their workforce through telework or remote work. And back to the first question you asked me, Matt, around how this relates to inequities.
Yeah.
I think I want to comment on this being an opportunity for leaders and organizations to really look at how this can change employment models so that worker well-being can be improved. And those benefits that research is being done, those benefits are being shown now, and so are the gaps and the inequities that are coming about and being shown. So I think that this is a great opportunity, but as it relates to total worker health, the biggest areas that we're seeing this be an opportunity, remote work being an opportunity to improve, is around health and mental health, and being able to provide benefits for being able to arrange and have flexibility in schedules. And that stability and flexibility comes with a lot of complexities, but can result in overall morale of the workforce, and also better health outcomes, because people can go to the doctor, people can take a mental health day and a sick day. They can also be able to juggle some of those non-work demands that they face, that they've been struggling with to do so when they're required to be in the office. So I think it's a real opportunity. Those of us in total worker health are seeing this as a real opportunity to improve some of those outcomes that we've been looking at around employee well-being.
Rashida, I want to go back for a moment to the research on, because I was just thinking about an article you wrote, I think a year ago, and I'm wondering if maybe the data have changed on this. What I recall was a piece looking at research on hybrid models and finding that hybrid models were the most exhausting models for employees. Does that ring a bell to you as well?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
So where do you think what have we learned since that? And is hybrid work still the most exhausting, you think? And maybe I'll also ask you, does it matter? Because it may be that we're just forced to do hybrid work because there is this preference, and some people strongly prefer working from home. Others strongly prefer working on site. And unless you're willing to lose a lot of employees in one direction or the other, you're going to have to figure out how to do hybrid work.
Yeah. No, yeah, I remember that study. Hybrid was the most exhausting for people versus being fully on site or fully remote. And I think it's just a matter of, again, hybrid is such a loose term, and people get in their heads what hybrid means. And so they come up with a version of hybrid that doesn't really work for anyone. And so that's probably why it's the most exhausting. It's like people are like, oh, to do hybrid, you have to come in 3 days a week, or you need to come in 2 days a week. And that's what we mean by hybrid. And it's probably the most exhausting because a lot of the employees don't necessarily have a choice. There are companies that say, oh, we're going to be hybrid. So that means nobody comes in on Monday and Friday and everybody comes in, Tuesday through Thursday. Well, some people don't like that. And so for them, that's going to feel just exhausting, those 3 days that they have to come in the office, that they didn't pick, that they didn't choose, that, maybe Wednesday's the day that their kid plays soccer, and it would make their life so easy if they just have to leave and drive the 10 minutes to the school from their house to be at that game at the end of the day, instead of commute through like an hour of traffic. So I think, autonomy, that's really what is making people feel the best about their work situation. And the more employers can give their employees autonomy, that's where you're going to have the most success. And even in positions that don't allow for a lot of hybrid or remote work, figuring out ways to be flexible as an employer is really important to employees. My mother was a teacher. She never took a sick day. It was just a mess. She didn't like to come back to the classroom because the kids were all kind of squirrely. The substitute never taught the lesson plan. And she's like, it's not worth it. But in those jobs where it's really hard to take a day off, being able as an employer to say, yes, please do take that day off. Do take that sick day. Do, go and see your kid graduate from school and do those kind of things that are going to make your life better. And And I think it's hard for employers to do that because in some of the, hourly jobs, if people wanted to take time off, it was just a matter of going around to your coworkers and seeing who could cover your shift and doing all this kind of stuff. And now, because that's never been the case in white collar jobs, bosses are like, I don't like this, having to go figure out who can cover shifts. But that's really where we're at, where white collar jobs are kind of trying to give these employees who may not necessarily have the ability to work from home the same kind of flexibility that you get in some of the jobs where you can find someone to cover your shift and go do what you need to do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the questions that came through in the chat, I think is definitely worth addressing. And that's we've talked a bit about inequities broadly, but there are also inequities within a work environment. And in particular, there are work environments where some people have to be on site because their job requires being on site, but others don't. And there may be dispute about a gray area in between there, right? And those kinds of inequities may actually be very disruptive to the workplace. So the questioner is asking, are there, sort of best practices for work environments where some of the people working there actually do need to be there on site, but others don't. And so now you've got, unlike pre-pandemic, you've now got a pretty vacant space with only a few people there and everyone else working from home potentially. And the people who have to come in may feel, I don't know what the right word is, put upon, disrespected. And yet it's the job description. So what are the best practices there in terms of trying to retain a sense of teamwork? And maybe I'll put this, by the way, in the frame that Rashida, you just brought up for me, which is the whole concept of self-determination theory, right? That people are happiest at work when they have a sense of autonomy, when they feel competent at what they're doing, but challenged, and where they have a good work team, where they have good relationships with the people on the team. So you're trying to sort of optimize all three of those things, being, sense of competence and challenge, sense of autonomy over your work life, and the relationships. And the hybrid work environment may be destructive to some of these relationships in the sense that some people end up having less autonomy, feeling like they have less autonomy because they've got to come to work and the others don't.
Well, one way that we're speaking to this is by not actually creating silos between, the office workers and the remote workers, and through being able to address it through the lens of, we have this workforce, these are the jobs and responsibilities, and then presenting what is being offered for flexibility in a way that where those that have job functions that require them to be in a physical space still feel that they do have that autonomy, they do have access to the same benefits that those that are not working from a physical space or working remotely also have. And this comes up even when you have everyone in a physical space. I want to speak to one of the comments that came in because it relates about the employees with children or with caretaking responsibilities versus those that don't. And we had a conversation about this as it relates to supporting caregivers in the workplace. And regardless if you are remote or in office, you should be presenting, organizations should be presenting opportunities for that autonomy and flexibility. So this might be working four tens so that the person who's required to come into the physical space can have a flex day. It might be adjusting hours so that they're able to make accommodations to non-work demands that they have outside. And when it's presented in that way, and there's still options and flexibility given to those roles and to those responsibilities, I think there's less scrutiny or less discrimination that can be put on those types of positions. The other thing that's important is that there's very much the autonomy in making and choicing into those positions. So what I'm interested in is seeing as this evolves, are those types of positions that require physical presence going to be pursued and occupied by certain types of people versus those that want to have a remote work life? And I think we're going to start to see that as this trend continues. We've seen that with the gig economy and people pulling out of the workforce to be self-employed because that's what they want to do, even though it means maybe taking a pay cut. So we're seeing, this is having massive societal impacts, and I think it's going to be really interesting to follow.
Sorry, I muted myself so I could cough. In terms of sort of how, different people are different. And one of the things we talked about in our pre-conversation was the fact that CEOs tend to be extroverts who get, who are recharged by being around other people and being in the office and those kinds of interactions. But that doesn't work for everyone. And I do wonder about sort of stratification of the workforce in terms of who's liable to succeed in a hybrid work environment and who's not. And is that going to evolve over time as we get better at doing hybrid work? Rashida, could we go back to? Sorry, that was just my comment. That wasn't a question. I wonder if we could go back to some of the inequities again, because one of the things I wanted to get at is some of the geographic implications of the change to remote work. We have in Colorado mountain towns that have been completely changed because of the hybrid work environment. And so, while we're talking about sort of hybrid work and its implications and ethical implications at the level of individuals and at the level of companies, there's also something going on, at the level of towns and communities. And I wonder if you've seen research on this, or is this an area that also just we don't know how it's going to play out yet?
I think this is one where we're not really sure how it's going to play out, but we have seen people like my brother-in-law lives in Austin, or my brother lives in Austin, and my sister-in-law, and that community has changed immensely. And homes are incredibly expensive because Austin it's in Texas, and it's a fairly diverse community. And so people would like to live there, but the home prices are much cheaper in Austin than they were in San Diego, where you couldn't get anything under like 1.5 million. So the people who could spend 1.4 million have come to Austin and driven up the housing prices. And, because they're like, oh, wow, 400,000, boom, I got you. And it's changing those communities, and it's making them, because these people are working remotely, and making the big San Diego salaries and working in Austin. And it is changing because then you've got people who are working and living in those communities who can't afford to live in those communities anymore because, then their commutes become longer. So there are some issues. And I know at the beginning of the pandemic, there was some talk about, well, if you're going to move to Austin, we're going to cut your salary because you don't need, $200,000 to live in Austin. You just need $100,000.
Yeah.
You need whatever. And so there was a lot of pushback on that. And so that didn't really seem to happen, but it will be interesting to see sort of how is this going to change if people are taking a big city salary and moving to a place that doesn't need it. What does that do to that community? And we don't have a lot of answers.
I remember that conversation earlier. I want to say this was pre-pandemic, where Google paid employees very differently depending on where that person lived. Has that been rolled back now? So as a Google employee, you don't get paid more if you live in the Bay Area compared to if you live in Wyoming?
I don't know. I still think that was the general policy. Like if they hired you initially outside there, the question is if you moved, if they actually lowered your salary. And that I don't know, because I know there was a lot of pushback on that.
So if you want to be hired by Google, you want to move to San Francisco, get hired, and then move back to Wyoming.
Yes.
Julia, sorry, I interrupted.
No, you're good. I'd like to touch on Rashida's comment because I think it's good to, explore all sides of this question. So I live in a really small rural town. Was living in Colorado. I moved to a smaller rural town where my friends and family are. And as one of the things that our town really needs is people, people to go out to eat, we need people, just people drive the economy. And so, my town, we have an incentive program specifically targeted at teleworkers, first time home buyers that are teleworking to come here. You get, incentive payouts, you get, free coffee at the coffee shop for a year, because, we need those people to come here and help grow our economy, because, we have a restaurant open and it closes 4 months later because there's not enough business. So I think that there's a really neat balance to try and find where, yes, more teleworkers are going to move to the hot spots where everyone wants to be, where the nightlife is, where the outdoors are. But at the same time, teleworking may provide an avenue for smaller towns that need people, that need to build their culture and need to, build their economy. To people may come because they are teleworking. So I think it's a really interesting dynamic to consider.
So I realize we're past 1 o'clock, which means we've got about 25 minutes left, and we'll continue to look at questions that are coming in through the Q&A, but I also want to start moving towards the sort of closing takeaways here in terms of what do we know in terms of best practices, what works to address some of these concerns about, flexibility, about equity issues, about accountability and monitoring practices to ensure productivity. That whole, how do you know they're working question, the trust question, the intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation question. So we can start with any of you, but Lily, you're already unmuted, so we'll start with you in terms of if you had 2 or 3 things that you think every employer and maybe every employee ought to be doing right now to optimize the benefits and mitigate the risks of the work environment as it is evolving into this hybrid space, what would you say are the 2 or 3 things people should be doing?
Well, I absolutely think that in situations where it's possible, employers should be finding ways to offer flexibility in how people do their work. And this requires establishing trust. It requires an enhancement in how management is communicated and is trained in the way to identify what employees need. It also requires a check-in on how this is structured in a way where it's fair and a win-win for everybody. And that absolutely will involve trade-offs and the realities that come along with it that we've talked about today. So that's my first takeaway is offering flexibility. The second one is for this as a field, for this as a topic, for us all on here today as taking interest in this topic, is to continue to assess how these changes are taking place, to be able to identify opportunities and gaps that we could help address in an effort to look at ways that we can help reduce inequity. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities. And so those are my 2 big takeaways.
I did it again. I have to stop coughing. That's the final way to solve this problem. We did get a question, it's very tight, specific question in the Q&A about research on PTO versus sick time and mental health days. And I'm wondering if we have best practices in that regard. There must be research on the differences between how people are offered flexibility in taking time off.
Yeah.
And again, that's unrelated to telework, but I think it's important in this context.
Well, absolutely. And I can answer this because the future is PTO. That's well, we're past that, right? So those companies that are still separating vacation and sick are losing out on an opportunity to have fairness and transparency for people taking what they need without disclosing it as vacation or sick. And so there's absolutely research to show that being able to take a mental health day by being able to have a bank instead of or being able to actually create a policy where a mental health day can be taken as sick time is beneficial for outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will say, I've seen different kinds of research on that, and some are against PTO just not because it's bad, but because some people don't take sick leave, because if they take a PTO day, that means I don't take a vacation day. So some organizations have said sick leave is better, not to have, you don't have to have unlimited sick leave, but to give your workers a pool of leave that is dedicated to sick. So if they actually are sick, that they're going to take that day. They're not going to be like, oh, I got a vacation coming up, I don't want to lose my PTO. No, I'm sick and I'm going to go home sick and use my sick day. So having some, whether it's sick or PTO, being sure that people feel comfortable taking that sick day is going to be important, because they're not going to take it if it feels like I'm losing a vacation day.
Yeah, and I
Very
want to
interesting.
add on to what Rashida has to say. And I agree that I think having a designated sick day or a sick time to draw from is especially important when we do start to think about the implications of teleworking, because we know that telework, it gives us more opportunity to work when we're sick. Especially on days
Really?
we have meetings, or we're just doing kind of side task, answering emails throughout the day. It gives us the opportunity. More people work sick when they have the opportunity to telework. But when people are given these resources and there's a culture that says, take your sick day, people are going to take those sick days and they're going to recover successfully, and they're going to do better work when they come back versus not performing, and potentially performing poorly whenever they're trying to work when sick. So I agree with Rashida that having a designated sick time is important.
Very interesting. Julia, do you want to continue us on your sort of thoughts about what are best practices given the
Yeah.
evidence that we've got right now? And we'll go back to the more targeted around hybrid or telework. What would you make as recommendations, either to organizations, their leadership, or to employees?
Sure. I want to touch on each of those points with
Okay.
a recommendation for each. So I think, for organizations, I think that, like Lily mentioned, offering flexibility in whatever form they can is important, and that's what folks desire. But at the same time, having a standardized criteria for who can telework, what happens when folks are teleworking, where can people telework from? It doesn't necessarily have to be the same across all organizations, but it needs to be the same within an organization so as to mitigate inequity or potential disparity. And, for individuals that do need telework as an accommodation, that's something where organizations, they can now leverage telework as a way to better support those employees. So that would be kind of my organizational recommendation. For leaders and supervisors that are managing dispersed workers, it is important to maintain personal relationships. So checking in with employees, not asking about their work, but touching base, having meetings. So, if you have a fully remote workforce, still cultivating relationships. And then for workers, I think it's really important when teleworking to think about that boundary between your home life and your work life, and what is going to make the most sense for you. And to the extent possible, allowing yourself some separation and that from your work and your home life. And that separation is going to look different from everyone. I'm in a unique position where I don't have children. I can and I have an office. I can come in here and work, and as soon as I'm done working, I can shut the door and I can leave it behind me. But that's not going to be the same for everyone. So finding those ways where it's maybe you just designate a portion of your kitchen table and that's where you work and you don't work anywhere else, so that you can disconnect when the time comes. That would be my recommendation for individuals. And then I was also going to offer, me and my colleague from Colorado State University, Gwen Fisher, just this past January, published a review on everything we kind of know about teleworking and what it means for individuals' health and well-being. And I think for the audience, if interest is there, there's a section at the very end. No need to go read the whole paper, but there's a section at the very end that says implications for practice. And I'll include the link. It's open access, so anybody can read it, but it gives just some general, best practices for organizations as we continue to adopt teleworking arrangements.
And we just got a question to the chat that I want to highlight because it's coming back to something we touched on earlier, but I don't know if we got to what are best practices, which is if you've got full remote workers, you've got hybrid workers, and maybe even you've got some people who are on site. So like our university, we have all three categories. What are strategies that managers can use, especially if the manager themselves is remote, which is often the case, to support those who are on site or who are, doing the hybrid thing? That's open to any of you. Do we have best practices in that sort of mixed environment yet?
Sure. So I think that I'll kind of draw from the research for just a second here, and then kind of get more practical. So even before COVID-19, we saw in the research that there were benefits to hybrid working. So individuals that worked, I think, up to 40% of their time around telework had the best outcomes when it came to supervisor relationships, work-related well-being, relationships with coworkers, as well as relationships with family members. But working more than that, you don't necessarily see any extra benefits, but you also don't necessarily see a decline. So all that to say is that we can make hybrid work and we can make full-time telework work. What is important, to kind of touch on that ethics and intentional piece, is going back and checking in on your workers and listening to your workers. If you ask them, they will tell you, as long as there's a climate of trust there, what they need to form relationships and complete their work, whether they're hybrid or remote. So I would say, or fully in office. And just to mirror some things that Lily has been saying, ask them about what types of flexibility they need. So if you have full-time workers in the office who aren't receiving those benefits as hybrid employees, ask them, what are the ways that we can provide you with flexibility given the constraint of your work? And a lot of the times employees know what they need to feel better and do better at work.
Great. And then Rashid, I want to put you on the spot a little bit because I feel like we talked around the sort of monitoring and trust issue. But I would love to know, I guess I'll be very blunt. What if you don't trust your employees?
Then you shouldn't hire
working.
them. I mean, you should fire these people. If you don't think the person's going to do the job, why are they at your organization? I mean, that's really the overarching question. And that's the issue you get with sort of these people who do all this monitoring. It's like, if you trust your employees so little, these are probably not the people who should be working for you. You should do something else. I mean, who have you been hiring that, all these times you're getting all these weird things? And we make these rules a lot of.
Oops.
Oh.
Did she freeze for everyone else?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, why don't I turn to Lily? Are you willing to jump in on this? I love the answer, by the way. Oh, Rashida, are you back? You froze for a moment.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, no, I was just saying, No, it's, I was just saying, yeah, you have to trust your employees. If you don't, then they shouldn't be your employees. And it's hard because businesses are always sort of like bottom line me, tell me, they want sort of hard, concrete answers. We don't have them.
Right. So I'll go back then to the broader question of, so what do you think are the main takeaways from the conversation today or from what you've read and reported on recently? Are there best practices that you would advise at the level of organizational leadership, at the level of employees, at the level of social policy? You may have given the most thought to the sort of big picture on this.
Yeah. I think for organizations, the biggest thing is going to be to accept that you're going to have to do the work, that there aren't these great answers out there. The answer is maximum flexibility, to be as flexible as you can for your workforce and their needs. And that requires you to actually survey your workforce. And guess what? They're not going to tell you the truth if last time you surveyed them, you got the answers and did nothing, because they don't believe you're going to do anything with it. So it's you have to build trust with your employees and then survey them. And even if you can't do what they ask you to do, say, we heard that you said this, this, and this. This is the problem that we're having with doing the 2 or 3 things, but this is the one thing that we can do right now. And you've got to build that trust relationship and work with what your employees have and what your work situation is. If you are a municipality and you would like to give maximum flexibility, well, the trash still has to be picked up every day. Those guys can't telecommute, they can't phone it in, but maybe they can, maybe you actually hire an extra person. And so there's some shift switching so that they can get maximum flexibility. But you've got to look at your situation and figure out what your employees need and how to give that to them. And it takes time. And so you're not going to have this answer like, oh, we're going to telework or we're going to hybrid work and everyone come in this time and this is the answer and everyone will be so happy, because that's not how it works. You have to figure out what the employees need. It's sort of like child rearing, which is difficult.
Yeah, one of the things I'm definitely hearing is that sort of the way to make hybrid the worst of all possible worlds is to say everyone has to come in Monday, Thursday, and Friday. And because that sort of loses the component of flexibility, which is what makes it very appealing to begin with. Am I hearing you all correctly that that if you're going to do a hybrid environment, it has to be also flexible in terms of when people are in the office?
Primarily. On the other hand, there to satisfy the people that are in office and that are managing, it does help to set some expectation, and that can be a day, right? That can be a day where everyone is coming in, because one of the goals usually with having people come in is to have the benefits of being able to interact. So you have a day set aside. We do this. We have Tuesdays where people come in, and that's when our admin meetings are. And that's when the water cooler chats can happen and those connections happen. And that's really important and successful. It's effective at satisfying the needs of maintaining flexibility for the other time, right, of work, and also the needs of needing to connect, and sometimes realistically the needs of managers that want to see people. And when you have a flexible work situation where people are in and out, and the big takeaway is being able to know what people are doing in hybrid work situations. And so maintaining that level of communication so that you know where your supervisor is, you know where your direct reports are, you know where your coworkers are, you know where your teammates are. There's nothing left to be questioned. And that's what people feel uncomfortable. That's when people feel uncomfortable, is uncertainty, and makes them nervous about the whole situation, is when they don't know what's going on or where people are.
And I will just say one thing with that. I talked to a designer, like an architect who was talking about redoing your offices to help in this post-COVID world. And she says, nobody wants to sit in an office by themselves. Nobody wants to sit in an office by themselves and do Zoom. And nobody wants to sit in these sort of little cubicles by themselves. So if you're having people come in, have them come in together. I mean,
Right.
if you can come up with a team day, that's going to be a good practice for you, so that you know, because if everybody's just coming in
Ad
randomly,
hoc. Yeah.
yeah, they come in and they sit in a Zoom meeting, and it's like, well, why am I here at the office? What was the point of this? And so you really need to give people what you wanted when you asked them to come in, which is, you know, a collegial atmosphere. If they're coming in, that should be there. So make a real good point of having those days.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive to that. I've had a few days where I came into the office and had nothing but Zoom meetings all day, and, you know, 2 or 3 other people in the building, but not a lot of interaction. And it is a little, it makes you wonder, why did I make the commute?
Exactly.
One of the chat, being the only person in the office is depressing. So, okay, so I'm modifying my best practice take home to say maybe one day every week or 2 days a month or something
And
like that is a best practice.
Yeah, a designated time, and it might be a day. There's another comment that I've seen is very common, which is certain meetings, right? That should be held in person are mandatory, and the rest of the time is flex. So it's either it's really back to the purpose.
I agree with Lily. I think it coming down to considering the nature of the work, what type of job is it, what type of organization is it, and then also I agree, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a one day a week, but intentional coming into the office with purpose, where individuals know that they're going to have interpersonal interactions, and you know, you don't find yourself being the only person who comes in on the Tuesday after Labor Day and sit by yourself. So
So maybe what we're ending on is where we started when we titled the session, which is intentional hybrid work. And we titled it that to distinguish it from what happened at the beginning of the pandemic, which was forced remote work, not done with intention for the most part, but because we had no other choice. But here we are 2.5 years in, and we have a lot of lessons learned, and moving forward, there's really no excuse to have not learned some of those lessons and to be more intentional as we design the hybrid work and remote work environment. So maybe that's a nice place for us to wrap up. Are there any closing comments from the three of you? Lily, I'll have you go first.
Thanks, Matt, and to my fellow panelists for having me in this really rich discussion. Like I said before, I think this is just a really exciting time, and we touched on, you know, the surface level in most of these, but I think that it's a great opportunity for us, as Julia said, that it's non-negotiable now. And so the conversation has shifted. I remember when the conversation was like, should our company do social media or not? And now, you know, it's like, nope, this is it. So you know, this is a wonderful conversation, and I think it's just a great opportunity for the future of work.
So funny, this is going to totally give away my age, but when I was a resident, there was a legitimate conversation about how do we get the residents to read their emails.
There you go.
Because they expect that all the important stuff is going to go to their mailbox in their mail room, and everyone checks their mailbox, but they don't check their emails.
So we can evolve.
Yeah, we do evolve, like it or not. Good. Julia, any final comments?
well, now I don't even check my mailbox at the office. I go for months and then find all sorts of things.
Find a big pile, right?
But again, thank you to you and the rest of the panelists and all of our attendees. This has been great to discuss. And yeah, just touching on that intentional piece. I think that, you know, asking employees what they need to be successful when it comes to hybrid work, and that includes employees that don't have the opportunity to telework. I think that when we design workplaces with intention, leveraging what we know about different aspects of health and well-being, we can make hybrid work, full-time telework work, in-office work, if we consider all of the different individuals we have in the workplace, as well as different needs. So thank you all.
Excellent. And Rashida, we'll get you the last word.
Yeah, I just would echo what Julia and Lily said. I think it's really important to be intentional and to really give it some thought. And if you're a CEO who loves seeing people every day, know that not everybody does. Not everybody needs that same thing that you need. And so it's really important to look at what your employees need and try to come to some sort of compromise that makes the most people able to do their jobs in the best way possible through the work situation.
Wonderful. I will just mention, because Lee Newman just put something into the chat, which reminded me to remind you that the next in our series will be on November 2nd, and Lee will be moderating a conversation on the ethical issues of academic industry collaboration around worker health issues, research, implementation science. I expect that will be a very interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.